Welcome to the TTA's Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Welcome back to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Ruth Swailes. In this string of 4 episodes, we're talking all about the early years curriculum and also the skills and practice that underpin really effective early years development. In this episode, we're going to touch on the huge and very contentious term, or often contentious term, of school readiness. And I'm just going to kick off by saying, Ruth, what do you understand by the term school readiness?
Oh, it is contentious, isn't it? Do you remember that Ofsted report in 2014?
Yes.
Are you ready? About 20 pages long, where they actually concluded that nobody really knows what school readiness is, even when it is. You know, if we talk to people, I think there are a multitude of definitions. For me, school readiness is about being ready to learn, being ready to be independent, being excited about your learning. And there are obviously a range of key skills that you want children to have. And I think we can all agree that ideally we'd like children to be able to express their needs. We'd like children to be confident enough to have a go at new things. And we'd like children to be independent in terms of their toileting and feeding. You know, that would be the ideal. But I think it means many things to many people. And again, it depends what age we're talking about. You know, we used to be talking about school readiness as being ready for year 1 because that's when formal schooling officially starts. Many people now see that as being reception, but also I've had people saying, well, school readiness is nursery. And we now have 2-year-olds in school. Is it 2-year-olds? So I think it very much depends on the age and stage of the children you're talking about. And I've got a couple of schools now who are going to pursue the taking children from 9 months. You know, so I like to flip it and talk about, school being ready for the children as well. I think it's really contentious, and I think there are many, many different interpretations of it. I think it very much depends on whether you work in early years as well. People's perceptions of school readiness are interesting, shall we say.
I think you're right in terms of the interpretation of what is school readiness, because some practitioners I will speak to are very much centered around it's about being able to sit, being able to listen, and then you can get into lots of debates about, what is good listening. So I see lots of laminates stuck to the wall underneath the interactive whiteboard that says good listening is, straight backs, legs crossed, arms folded, eye contact. And again, for lots of children at the stage of development in early years, being open to listening means that listening is your main focus. But if I'm focused on keeping my core engaged, crossing my legs, sitting up straight, worried that the adult's going to tell me off, I'm not listening. So, there are so many things that I think school readiness isn't. And I think you're dead right, that idea of what is school, if we talked about that, school is, in the very simplest terms, it's a place for learning, but also learning to be a human being. If you want to get children ready to be learners, then it's those dispositions and skills that underpin learning. So drive, curiosity, resilience, all of those things, they are what makes children ready to receive the knowledge bit, which for me is kind of at the very end of the learning journey, because you can't effectively receive and retain knowledge if you aren't engaged in the process, or if you aren't at a stage where that knowledge is relevant to what you do.
I think, children are acquiring knowledge from birth, aren't they? They're making sense of the world around them. And I talk a lot about sort of proximal to distal. So, if you think about a very young baby and think about Margaret Parton's ideas of different types of play, that early play in the first 3 months where you're literally finding your feet and your hands, so and then it's going wider and wider and wider, and by the time we actually get to a setting or a school at whatever age, we're then starting to see that there are other people in the world and that we might want to interact with them, and that very much depends on life experience, but we're acquiring that knowledge all of the time. But we're doing that in a way that is meaningful to us. And I think the issue that I have with the term school readiness is some people seem to interpret it as emulating what happens in Key Stage 2.
Yeah.
So I have seen, for example, Ofsted reports which talk about early years children learning to sit like a scholar. Now, as somebody who does scholarly things occasionally myself, sitting like a scholar often involves lying on my tummy in front of the fire. So if that's how
Absolutely.
it is, that could be it. But what does sitting like a scholar look like, and is that necessarily desirable? And I think the Kindred study, the recent report that came out about school readiness, very, very small sample, so I think we need to always be cautious around that anyway. But it had some really interesting things, and one of the things that it put down as school readiness was sitting still. And if you think about NHS guidelines, young children should not sit still for long periods of time. 180 minutes of activity every day, 60 minutes of which gets you out of breath. Sitting still is probably not desirable. And how long are we talking about? Are we talking about for 2 minutes? Or are we talking about that phonics session that's going to be an hour long that some people and how inappropriate that would be for a 4-year-old, So I think we need to be, like everything, the devil is in the detail, isn't it? We need to be really clear what we mean by sitting still. We need to be really clear about what we mean by the readiness agenda. And we need to understand that readiness isn't about emulating what older children do. Just because you can do that, it doesn't mean you should.
But a lot of those readiness statements are linked to compliance. So can you sit still? Can you be quiet? Can you line up at the door? All of those things are about really discipline as opposed to being, are you an effective learner? So are you massively engaged? Do you walk through the door? Is your provision such that you see children who are massively absorbed in it and return to it? And like you said in a previous episode, do you give your children opportunities to build on what they create in provision, or do we have that kind of big and tidy culture where everything gets tidied away at the end of every day and or the end of every session, and children don't have a chance to revisit? So how do you develop a sense of resilience? And if you also think that being effective in anything we do is very much linked to our well-being, we want learners who have high levels of well-being, because when you feel good about yourself and life, then life is good. If that constant need to make them comply, sit up straight, fold your arms, cross your legs, fingers on lips, line up at the door. And again, a reception I worked with very early in September had carpet sitting practice, where the practitioner had an alarm on her iPhone that went off every 20 minutes, and it was the big nah, 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 nah. And when that went off, and she did it with great excitement and said to the children, right, the alarm's gone quick. And they all ran to find their carpet space and sat with their legs crossed and their arms folded. And when everybody was sat down, she was like, right, back we go. And she said, basically, every year I do that for the first kind of week or so, because that gets children to know where their carpet spot is and gets them sitting in the way that we expect them to sit. So I thought it was really interesting that of all the things you do on entry to school in reception, sitting in your carpet space with your legs crossed and your arms folded comes top of the list.
And I think it's interesting, there's some conversations there about priorities and age appropriateness and anything like that always comes from a good place. People want to do the best for children.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be a balance, hasn't there? Because whether we like it or not, there are elements of life is sometimes you do have to comply. If you don't, you're getting bothered, don't you? So we've got to teach children about boundaries, and children need structures, routines, expectations, absolutely. And I would hate for anybody to think that I sometimes get this sort of there's this dichotomy, and it's a false dichotomy around early years, where either all swishing around doing whatever we like and it's all very free form and nobody's in control of anything, which is nonsense. I've been an inspector, I've been an advisor, I've been a teacher, I've done all of the roles like that, and I've visited literally thousands of schools over my career, and I've probably seen a handful of places where it's like that.
Yeah.
Or we're all sitting down, complying, sitting like scholars, and nobody's allowed to move, and we all have to do things in a very rigid. Very few places are like that. Most places are somewhere in between, and you have to prioritise. And so, again, I often say, just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. If you're doing something, you are giving it status, you are giving it time, and your time is precious. Those children's time with you is limited and it's precious. So I think we have to look at what are the time-sensitive skills that we need. And we know the time-sensitive skills because Dame Claire Tickell put them, right at the forefront when she did the review in 2011 that led to the new framework in 2012 that gave us the prime areas. We didn't have those before. We had the 6 areas of learning, and they were all of equal status.
Yeah.
Now the primes are very much, these are at the forefront. And that is because when she looked at all the evidence, she said, these are the things that make the biggest difference, and they're time sensitive. So for me, if we're going to be school ready, we have to get those in place. We have to get the PSED, the communication language, and the physical. And the one that I worry about probably more than the other two is physical, because I feel like physical gets sidelined. And my friend Helen Batley talks about this. It's the poor relation of the primes. You talk to people and say, oh, we do PE, or we go outside. But do we actually understand the huge impact of physical development, for example, on well-being, but also on children's writing, on children's reading?
Yeah.
If I can't cross my midline, if I haven't got bilateral integration, I'm not going to be a reader or a writer.
No.
So we need to focus on that, and this focus on sitting still. Why? There is absolutely no research evidence to show that sitting still makes you a better learner.
I think
control.
And we talked a little bit in a previous episode about things like schemes and phonics schemes and math schemes and, curriculums, a very kind of tight version of a curriculum. And a lot of that requires sitting still for long periods of time and listening. Given what we know about neurodiversity, and the more that we're finding out about neurodiversity and within the children that we have in our learning spaces. I mean, when I first started to teach, the term diversity didn't exist, but nor was it ever part of my articulation of how a child might behave or not behave within a space. It was just you complied with the behaviour policy or you sat outside of the behaviour policy, and that wasn't based on individual children. It was based on some Victorian mechanism that had been handed down, over the decades. So this idea that effective learners are children who can sit still and be compliant, again, is not based in science or what we know about child development. No. So we are needing to, again, going back to a point you made earlier, when I work with practitioners, you rarely get those two extremes between completely free flow and then completely strict. What I tend to find is if I am working with practitioners and it's just us, then you see that kind of balance between the two. But if anybody should walk in, be it senior leadership or local authority, whatever it may be, they always tend to then flip into making it more formal, gathering together, because I think there's that kind of subconscious expectation as a practitioner that you're being judged. And if you are engaging in play, it all just looks like everybody's playing together and basically getting paid a wage to play all day, which is not a bad thing to do. But if you can be seen to teach, or you can be seen to manage, or you can be seen to control, again, so I think subconsciously you're giving whoever's making that judgment of you a marker that you're doing something. So it's about changing that narrative.
I think it comes back to confidence, though, doesn't it? And I've been that teacher. I worked with my last teaching job before I became a head. I worked with a fabulous head teacher who was secondary trained. And she was quite upfront. She said, I really don't understand early years, and that's why you're here to help me with that. And I fell into the habit. I seemed to be, every time she walked through my classroom, which was frequently because you had to walk through my classroom to get to the nursery. It was really poorly designed as a school.
Always.
And so constant streams of people, which is great because the children get used to it, you get used to it. Every time she came through, I was in the role play area. It just seemed to be. And I'd started in the January and it had got to Easter and I thought, I'm going to have to do something about this because I'd got myself into that state of being a teacher, so I'd almost got to the stage where I was leaping up and bombarding them with questions. And at this point, I've been teaching like 17 years and I thought, this is ridiculous. I know what I'm doing. And she's told me I'm here because she knows. So I went and had a conversation with her and I said, look, no, I just need to talk to you. Every time you come through my classroom, I'm in the role play and I just want you to know that I am teaching. She went, I know you are. And she said, do you honestly think I'd have let you to get to Easter and just think you're having a bit of a mess about? And she said, I would have come and said something to you. I said, I just needed to clarify that. But I kind of reflect on that now. And whenever anybody's doing anything, I always think, where's that coming from? What's that about? What's driving that behaviour? And it's fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
It's fear and anxiety of being judged. It's fear and anxiety that people won't get what you're doing. So I think this is where we have to be confident and go, this is how I'm doing it and this is why. and own that. So, you will come into my classroom and you won't see children sitting still for long periods of time because it is not appropriate. And when I explain to head teachers and senior leaders, and I do this a lot, when we look at the sheer cognitive load that sitting still takes when you are still developing your core, when you're still finding your proprioception, when you don't quite know where your body is in space, you soon realise that after 2 or 3 minutes, I'm no longer listening to what Mrs. Swailes is saying. I am focusing on holding myself up, sitting nicely, not falling over into my mate next to me, and making sure that I don't get into trouble for that. So I could be speaking, Spanish at the front of the class, and it wouldn't make any odds to those children because they would be, they've tuned out. And we've all seen it. We've all sat on a carpet with children and thought, I'm losing them now. It's time to move them on.
Yeah. And for the ones...
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think the problem with some of the schemes is that it doesn't allow you to. And that's really problematic.
Yeah. And there are those children whose emotional regulation is such that they need to comply because they have appreciated that the compliance and the adult recognition of compliance is a reward scheme for them. And then there are those whose emotional regulation is such that they don't feel that need, and then that's where you see patterns of behaviour start to happen. And then also that's when children begin to get labelled as that one rude boy, that wriggly boy, the one who can never sit still. And again, there's lots of research out there that talks about, those labels come very quickly. And once you've got one as a child, well, I was in a reception the other day and a child was in trouble, and I was talking to some other children and they were saying, oh, but she's a very naughty girl. And I thought, at 4, she's already been labelled as the naughty girl. And so therefore for her to lose that label is going to be really difficult.
And I think, we talk a lot about self-regulation. We need to recognise that before children can self-regulate, we need to co-regulate. And I think
absolutely
we also need to recognise that as adults, we don't always regulate. I am a little frustrated at times with some of the narratives, and it's not necessarily coming from early years teachers or even primary teachers. Sometimes you see on social media the way that people talk about students, and I just think, and pupils and children, and I just think you hold those children to far higher levels of accountability than you hold yourself, and then you hold, people like politicians, for example. And I remember when the self-regulation early learning goal came out, and I looked at it and thought, if we applied that to some of the people sitting in Westminster, they would not meet the standard expected of a 4 and 5-year-old. I think we need to look at it through the lens of young children. What does that regulation look like when you are a very young child? Because actually I'm still working out who I am in the world. And people talk about having rules, and absolutely we need to have rules, we need to have expectations, we need to have routines. But do these children actually understand that they are part of this group? I've been in settings where children don't know the names of the other children, where children don't know the names of the teacher. So they're clearly not yet seeing themselves as part of a group. So if I'm sitting there at the front talking about rules, that the rules we have in this class, as a child, I might be sitting on the carpet thinking, that's interesting. They don't apply to me because every day.
I only have to come here once a day. Yeah.
And so you will get, children talking, teachers saying, they know the rules, they can tell me the rules. I mean, I always think of a little lad, George, walking around the class singing, you choose it, you use it, you put it away. And I say to him, can you do it now, George? Because he knew that was the rule, but he didn't know it applied to him. So I think we have to be very explicit with children. I think we underestimate how explicit we have to be. This might make me deeply unpopular because I'm going to talk about direct teaching, not necessarily all sitting in rows where I say, you do this, but as a practitioner, if we are explaining a rule, we need to say to a child, and that means you, because you're part of this team. Because unless they say that, they don't know that.
And actively work on building your cohort community, whether that be preschool, nursery, reception.
For 2-year-olds even. I taught 2-year-olds to do choose it, use it, put it away. But it takes time, and you have to nag, and you have to build it up. And one of the things that frustrates me is, I used to spend a lot of time in the provision in the early stages, showing my children how to use it, what the resources do. This is how we look after things here. This is how we do it here. This is what we do. And they'd wander off and I go, oh, come on, we have to leave it as we found it for the next person and all of that. And it takes time and you have to nag. And I talk to people about that because when you invest in that, you then know the children really well because you spent time in provision with them. So it's like a baseline assessment, like a proper baseline. But you also set the classroom up and the routines up and the expectations up for the year. And then somebody will always say, I'd love to do that, but I haven't got time. I need to teach. And I'm frustrated by that because I needed everybody to understand that is your job.
Teaching. Yeah.
That just because it isn't a scheme, that is just as important as all the other stuff. In fact, if you don't get that right, you're building on sand, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that's an excellent way to end this episode. We could literally have talked about school readiness probably for about a week. So I think what we're fundamentally saying is that school readiness is way more to do with how ready a child is to learn, as opposed to necessarily what they know or all of the compliance routines that they can take part of.
It's the dispositions, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, that's it for episode 3, but join us in episode 4 where Ruth and I will be discussing transition out of the early years into Key Stage 1. For now, Ruth, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I would just like to say a huge thank you to our guest today, Ruth, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TDS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Ruth Swailes. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content. This includes ideas for your setting and lots of links to relevant resources.